Going through the Gospel of Matthew on Sunday mornings. And chapter 21, look at verse number 17 with me. And the Bible says, He, that is Jesus, left them and went out of the city into Bethany, and he lodged there. Now in the morning, as he returned into the city, he hungered. When he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it, and found nothing thereon but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, How soon is the fig tree withered away? Jesus answered and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, if ye have faith and doubt not, ye shall not only do this which is done to the fig tree, but also if ye shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, it shall be done. In all things, whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing, ye shall receive. This is the final week of the Lord's earthly ministry. It's called the Passion Week. It is the week that He's going to the cross just in a day or two. And these verses just before this begins with the triumphal entry, where the Lord rides that donkey into Jerusalem, and great multitudes hail Him, Hosanna to the Son of David. That procession began at Bethany, about 5 miles outside of Jerusalem. It would have passed over the Mount of Olives down into the Kidron Valley. He would have come into Jerusalem through the eastern gate and ended up at the temple. And the Bible tells us that by the time he got there, it is evening. And so he observes what is happening in the temple, in those temple courts. And then he leaves and he goes back out to Bethany for the night. And then the next day, Jesus goes back into Jerusalem. This time there is no fanfare, there is no procession. And he goes back to that temple. And this is where he drives out the money changers and the crooks. We call it the cleansing of the temple. We looked at it a couple of weeks ago. And that really was the final straw for the Jewish elders. It's at that point that they get together and they begin to plot, how are we going to kill him? We've got to put him to death. The third day, Jesus goes back to Jerusalem. He goes back to the temple. And he has a confrontation with the Jewish elders. If you will look at verse number 23, where we stopped reading, when he's coming to the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, By what authority doest thou these things, and who gave thee this authority? So he comes back, and really the rest of the chapter deals with that conflict that he has with those religious elders. But there's a little incident that takes place in between those 2 days that he comes back to the temple. It is the cursing of the fig tree, the story that I read to you. It seems like a very small story. It seems like a very minor detail, certainly not as important as triumphal entry or cleansing the temple, those things. And so why is it here? And it actually is in Mark's gospel and in Matthew's gospel as well. When you read Matthew's gospel, it looks like it all happens at one time. But when you read Mark's gospel, you learn that it actually happened in 2 different times. Mark is more chronological. Matthew is more topical. And so what happens is, as the Lord is going into Jerusalem to cleanse the temple, he stops by and he curses the fig tree. It is the next day that when he comes back to the temple, they pass by the fig tree. The disciples look at it. They see that it is already withered away and it has died, and they marvel at it. So it actually is in 2 different parts. There is a parallel between cleansing the temple and cursing the fig tree, and it is this. Both of them are acts of authority and acts of judgment. Now remember, the people have just hailed Jesus as their king. So he's going to demonstrate to them the kind of king that I'm going to be. I'm going to be a king who reigns in righteousness, and that begins with cleaning up the mess that you have become. When he cleansed the temple, he was denouncing their religion. When he cursed the fig tree, he's denouncing them as a nation. They wanted him to come in judgment against the Romans, but instead he came in judgment against them. And they didn't want that then, and they don't want that now. No, we're fine with a king who would denounce everybody else, but we don't want to be denounced for our own sins. Such was the spiritual state of Israel. Now, when you read this little story in Matthew and in Mark, again, it seems like a minor detail. I think that we have learned by now that there are no minor, insignificant details in the Bible. And when you study this little incident, there are major prophetic principles that are hidden in the story. There are significant spiritual lessons that are hidden in the story. And there is great practical truth for you and I this morning at Victory Baptist Church. Notice with me, first of all, if you would, the illustration. The illustration, what happens here. And I want to talk to you about fig trees. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't know anything about fig trees before I started studying. But I wanted to know something about fig trees. Here's what I have learned, is that fig trees have 2 seasons every year in which they bear fruit. One in the summer and one in the winter. In that part of the world, in the Middle East, you can expect to get fruit sometime in late May or early June. Now we know that it is April right now in this text because the Lord dies on Passover, and that is in the month of April. So it is too early to find any figs on a fig tree. So it's not unusual to have a fig tree to be barren at this particular time. In fact, Mark says in Mark 11, he says the time of figs was not yet. It's too early to have any figs. But there's something else about fig trees that I didn't know. I read this. I said, I don't know if this is true or not. And so I verified it with 5 or 6 different sources, and every one of the sources verifies it. When a fig tree is barren, it is an ugly, gnarly looking tree. There are no limbs. It is just bare. There are no leaves, no foliage. It is just bare limbs is all that it is. But when it comes to bloom, now this is very important on a fig tree, the fruit comes before the leaves. At the end of the branches, there appear these little green knobs, and from that is the seed from which becomes figs. So you first have those little green knobs. That's the beginning of the fig. And then after that, then it develops leaves and foliage. So when you see a fig tree with leaves, the figs have already come. They may not be ripe yet. They may still be maturing, but the fruit comes before the leaves. If you pass by it and it is barren, then you know that there is no fruit there. But if you pass by it and it has leaves, then you would stop to check to see if the fruit is ripe yet. The fruit comes before the leaves. Now, Jesus would not have expected a fig tree to have fruit this early in the spring. So when he passes by this fig tree and it has leaves, it surprises him. Maybe it is planted in a very fertile place. Maybe it is planted by a brook where there's a lot of water to feed the roots. But what a pleasant surprise, this early in the season, to have a fig tree that you would expect to have figs. So he stops to pick figs from the fig tree, and here's what he finds. He finds nothing but leaves. That's all that he finds. Now let me make a couple of clarifications here real quick, all right? First clarification is that he wasn't really surprised to find no fruit on the tree, all right? You understand that Jesus knew before time what he would find, all right? I want to make sure of that. What you have is you have the humanity of Jesus in view here because the Bible says he was hungry. You have the deity of Jesus in view here because he's omniscient. He knows everything. So he's not surprised, all right? The second thing that I would say is that some commentators have all kinds of fanciful thoughts about Jesus' cursing the fig tree. And some say that he was irrational to curse it because it wasn't supposed to have figs. Some say that he's lashing out in anger and he's irritated and he just kind of on an impulse did that. And if you ever read any of that, it's foolish babble. That's what it is, all right? There's nothing irrational, nothing impulsive, nothing wrong, nothing rash about him cursing the fig tree. There was a reason why he did that. And then the third thing that I want to just add in here is why didn't the fig tree have any figs if it had leaves? And I believe that there is a reason for that. I believe that God made that tree barren for illustrative purposes. It didn't just happen to be there. I believe that God placed it there for Jesus to use it to illustrate something to the Jewish nation. And it served a greater purpose in dying than it did in living. There's a message there, and I don't have time to get off into it, but I believe it is there for a reason. But with all of that aside, Jesus comes to this tree. He's expecting to find fruit, and he finds nothing but leaves. And the leaves say, this is important, the leaves say that fruit should be there because the fruit comes before the leaves. But it's diseased, it's barren, it's fruitless. If I can say it like this, there was something wrong on the inside, though it looked good on the outside. And so Jesus cursed it. Now that doesn't mean that he cursed at it, but he pronounced a curse upon it. The curse is in verse number 19. He said, "Let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever." We know that the ground was cursed in Genesis 3 from the fall, right? But he pronounces a special curse upon this tree. It will never produce again. The next morning the disciples come by it. They're marveled because overnight it has withered up. All the leaves have fallen off. It is a gnarly, dead, barren, dormant branches, all it is. And this tree will never blossom again. That's an amazing thing to me. It's amazing to me that Jesus could give life with just his word. And Jesus could give death with just his word. He literally killed the tree by speaking to it. Now listen carefully to what I'm going to say. This is very important. Jesus did not curse the fig tree because it didn't have any fruit. I'll say it again. Jesus did not curse the fig tree because it's not bearing fruit. Say, how do you know that? It is not the time for figs yet. It's too early in the season. So there's nothing wrong with a fig tree in April not bearing fruit. Here's the problem. The problem is that it advertised that it bore fruit, but it didn't. The problem with the fig tree is that it is giving a false profession. It promises that there are figs there because of the leaves, but there is nothing there but leaves. Wake up right here, wake up, wake up. Nothing there but leaves. Matthew and Mark both say nothing but leaves. It had a profession, but no reality. That's the illustration. Let me give you the interpretation. What is it talking about? There are 3 trees in the Bible that are a type of Israel. Israel is a vine. Israel is an olive tree. Israel is a fig tree. You can never understand prophecy without understanding Israel. The entire prophetic picture of Israel can be told in the tale of 3 trees. Now, I can't get deep into this. Write this down sometime. Sometime go read Judges 9. Right? In Judges chapter 9, there is a strange parable. There Abimelech, who is the son of Gideon, wants to be king, and he's trying to convince others to make him king they want, and so he kills 70 brothers trying to get his way. One brother, Jotham, escapes, And in Judges 9, Jotham tells a parable. And in this parable, there are a group of trees that are talking to each other, trying to get another tree to be their king. So the trees come to the olive tree to be their king, and he refuses. The trees come to the fig tree to be their king, he refuses. The trees come to the vine to be their king, and he refuses. And so a bramble branch becomes their king. Some Bible students believe that it is prophetic of the nation of Israel. I somehow believe it is, but it is strange that those three trees are mentioned because Israel is represented in the Bible as a vine, a fig tree, and an olive tree. Let me show it to you quickly. Look at Psalm chapter 80. Hold your finger here. Go to Psalm chapter 80. I'll just give you a couple of verses so you think I know what I'm talking about. Psalm 80, look if you would in verse number 8. Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt. Thou hast cast out the heathen and planted it. Thou preparest room before it, didst cause it to take deep root, and it filled the land. The hills were covered with the shadow of it, and the boughs thereof more like the godly cedars. She sent out her boughs unto the sea, and her branches unto the river. It is a picture of God taking Israel out of Egypt and planting her in Canaan. God, the divine husbandman, prepared the ground by driving the Canaanites out, and when it is planted, that vine begins to spread all over the land. Look at Isaiah chapter 5 with me. Isaiah chapter number 5. Some of you will be familiar with this. Isaiah 5, verse number 1. Now will I sing to my beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. He fenced it and gathered out the stones thereof, planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. What is he talking about? Verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. He planted Israel in the vineyard of Palestine as the choicest vine. By the way, did everything that he could to make it prosper and for it to produce fruit, and it only produced, in verse number 4, he said, what could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. Because of that, God judges that. That vine doesn't produce fruit, so God cut it down, scattered it abroad. That is the condition of Israel today. In the end of Matthew 21, in fact, Jesus gives a parable about a man. We'll look at this in the next couple of weeks. He plants a vineyard and he entrusts it to husbandmen, and he never gets fruit. And those husbandmen killed his servants, that's the prophets, and they killed his son, that's Jesus Christ. He's using the Old Testament imagery of Israel as a vine. It's a vine. But then Israel is also an olive tree. Look at Jeremiah chapter number 11. Jeremiah chapter number 11. In Jeremiah 11, look at verse number 16. The Lord called thy name a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit, with the noise of a great tumult. He hath kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. For the Lord of hosts that planted thee hath pronounced evil against thee, for the evil of the house of Israel and of the house of Judah, which they have done against themselves to provoke me to anger in offering incense unto Baal. They're a good olive tree, but because of their idolatry, they're in danger of having the branches being, look at it in verse number 16, the branches of it are broken. When I think about branches being broken, it reminds me of Romans 11. Everybody look at your Bible. Look at Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, look if you would in verse number, Romans 11 and verse number 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather through their fall, the Jews, salvation is coming to the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Paul's answering the question, is God finished with the Jewish race because the kingdom has been postponed? And he says, no. Look if you would down in verse number 17. Here we are. If some of the branches be broken off, that reminds you of anything? If the branches be broken off, and thou, Gentile, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakers of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thereof. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I may be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Verse 21, oh, this is wonderful. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also spare thee not. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fail severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. They also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Here's what it's saying, that the natural branches of the olive tree have been broken off. That's Israel. The wild olive branch, that's Gentiles. We've been grafted in, made partakers of the Spirit. Well, I feel like preaching. Made partakers of the spiritual blessings. And the natural branches are not cut off forever, because they're going to be grafted back in. Here's what he's saying, is that Israel is cut off temporarily. God's dealing with the Gentiles, but he's going to revisit Israel. Israel is a olive tree. Olive tree. A lot of more preaching. I got to move that. Israel is a fig tree. A fig tree. Look in Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13. Just a little bit of Bible study, and then I'll go back to preaching, all right? Luke chapter 13, look at it. In verse number 6. He spake also this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came and sought fruit thereon, and found none. Then said he unto the dresser of his vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Well, I wonder what he's talking about there. These 3 years I've been ministering in Israel, preaching and teaching, and I'm looking for fruit, and I found none, so cut it down. Why cumbereth it the ground? And the answering said unto him, Lord, let it alone this year also, till I shall dig about it and dung it, and if it bear fruit, well, and if not, then after that thou shalt cut it down. That's a picture of Israel. For 3 years Christ has presented himself to Israel, and he's hoping for fruit. He pronounces judgment to cut it down. By the way, that's not immediate. Let's have some patience. Let's go a little bit longer. Let's just give it another year. It's not to AD 70 when Titus comes into Jerusalem that is cut down. In fact, go to Matthew 24. Matthew 24. Matthew 24, and we'll get to Matthew 24. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus gives what's called the Olivet Discourse. That's Matthew 24 and chapter 25. In verse number 3, the disciples ask for a sign. Tell us what then should be these things be. What shall be the sign of thy coming? And the Lord gives several signs. In verse number 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, that's a sign. He says in verse number 30, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. That's a sign. But watch this sign in verse 32. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. What happens in summer? It produces fruit. So when you see the fig tree come alive and it puts forth leaves, you know that that fruit is coming. So likewise, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. The fig tree, Israel, was cut down for being fruitless, but it wasn't completely destroyed. A new tree will spring from the root, and the nation of Israel will revive. And when you see that fig tree coming back to life, know that the Son of Man is coming. We have seen Israel come back to life as a nation in this generation, haven't we? And by the way, it's the leaves of Israel we've seen. It's not their fruit. They're still rejecting their Messiah. And only when Israel is converted at the second coming will they produce the fruit of faith. You say, now how does this fit into Matthew 21? Come back to Matthew 21, all right? There's 3 trees. The fig tree is a type of Israel. Now watch this. Jesus goes from cursing the fig tree to denouncing the temple. It's two acts of judgment. They're back to back. They're too close to not be connected. The fig tree is Israel. You are all leaves, but no fruit. It is the spiritual condition of the nation. He should have come and found faith in them, but for all of their spiritual show, there is no faith. He is saying that your religion is pretense. It is a lot of show, it is a lot of ritual, but there is nothing on the tree that can please me. It is what the Bible calls having a form of godliness but denying the power. It is what the Bible calls a zeal for God but not according to knowledge. And here's what Jesus says. He says, let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. Now some think that he's talking about Israel as a whole. And if so, then he's cursing the nation of Israel and God is abandoning the nation. Can't be so. Matthew 24 says the fig tree is coming back. Romans 11 said he's going to graft the natural branches back in to the olive tree. I believe that he's speaking particularly to that generation. That evil and adulterous generation that seeketh the sign, and is cursing that generation. You think of the special privileges of that generation. They are the generation that gets to welcome the Messiah and introduce the Messianic kingdom. And with that responsibility, they failed in their unbelief. And because of their rejection of Christ, the nation of Israel is scattered for at least the next 2,000 years. Those Jews would have known that in the Old Testament, the fig tree is a symbol for them. And when Jesus curses that fig tree, they should have known he's judging them is what he's doing. I don't have time to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, where he says, if you obey me, blessing, 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 blessing. If you don't obey me, curses, 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 curses. We don't have time to go back to Isaiah chapter 5, where he plants that vineyard, that tree, that vine in the vineyard of Palestine, does everything that he can do for her, and he's hoping to find fruit. And when he comes, he finds nothing but leaves. And so the rest of Isaiah 5 is woe unto you, and woe unto you, and woe unto you, and woe unto you. And there's a lot of curses because they disobeyed God. Can I tell you that even today, Israel is under the curse of God? And we often tend to think of Israel as a blessed nation. I tend to think of them more as preserved. How can they be blessed when they don't even recognize Messiah? They reject Jesus Christ today as much as they did then. They are still a religion with no fruit. They were cursed in Deuteronomy 8. They were cursed in Isaiah 5. They're cursed in Matthew chapter 21. And they're still cursed by the Lord. They haven't obeyed him yet. The illustration, the interpretation, the application. Preacher, I understand the prophecy side of it, but what do I get out of it? What do I take away from it practically? And here's the lesson. Is that profession without reality is cursed. It does you no good to profess a religion that doesn't produce fruit in your life. Some of you this morning, you're nothing but leaves. And you look good. But upon closer inspection, there is a disease that makes you barren of spiritual fruit. Do you know the first time fig trees show up in the Bible? It's in Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together to cover up their nakedness. It is a symbol of an attempt by man to cover up the fact that he has no relationship with God. And sitting in our churches all over America are men and women, boys and girls, teenagers and singles that are covering up with leaves, that they have no standing with God. They have a lot of leaves, but it is just a cover. And they come to church, and they put on a show, and they conform to the life that is expected of them, and they have no fruit of a relationship with Christ. And you see those Pharisees that are standing there. They are the most religious people on earth, and Jesus says that you are barren is what you are. There is nothing There was nothing that would bring a true revival more to a church than for church members, not the sinners, the church members, to become brutally honest with themselves about their own spiritual condition. If everybody in Victory Baptist Church would drop the mask and quit the games and just be honest. You prance around as if you're the most spiritual person in the room, when in reality you're a first-class Pharisee. You've made a list of all the real spiritual standards. They happen to be the ones that you adhere to, and that becomes your badge of spirituality. God wasn't impressed with their list, and God's not impressed with your list. And what you need to see is yourself is eat up with pride and arrogance, and it makes you look down on other people that don't keep the same list that you keep. And you need to be broken and exposed and laid bare in your bragging and your pride. It is nothing but a tree full of leaves that hides the fact that you don't have any fruit. There's nothing but leaves. And see, here's what we do. We tend to direct most of our preaching to those Christians who are lax in their standards because we're visible. Right? We're visible. Don't die on me. All right? We go after the dress and the music and the movies and the friends and all of that, and we should. And some of you have no separation. So some of you, and I'm preaching to members, some of you have no godly standards. And you don't because you'd rather be like the world than you would Jesus. Somebody help me a little bit. That wasn't the problem of the Pharisees. The problem of the Pharisees is not that they were worldly. Oh, no. The problem of the Pharisees is not worldliness. Their problem is that they're so religious, they are so separated, they are so zealous in their religious activity, and you would never know what is sitting in a Baptist church. You'd never know. And we have a good church. Singing's always good. Good fellowship, good people, good members, good, you know. But if you knew the sin and the hypocrisy and the double standard that sits in the average Baptist church, not the visitors, but in us. And when Jesus cursed that fig tree, he wasn't looking at the Roman pagans. He was looking at that Jewish nation that said, we worship God and we're looking for the Messiah. And he said, you are the fig tree. You are the ones that advertise that you have fruit, and you are nothing but leaves is all that you are. The longer that I pastor, the more I am convinced that there are lost church members in probably every church. And I don't pretend to know who and how many. I don't put figures on it. I don't believe that 100% of the membership of this church are true believers. I believe that some of you are moral, but you're not righteous. It'd be better for you if you were immoral. Because if you were immoral, then it'd be easier to convince you that you're not righteous. It's better to be headed to hell and know it than to be headed to hell and not know it. You can have great knowledge of the truth. You can sing the songs, you can quote the memory verses. You can be conformed to the standards, but in the private recesses of your heart, you don't like it. And you know how to guard yourself around certain people. You're one thing around the church, folks, you're another thing at school. And you know how to have a sweet and a likable spirit so that everybody thinks that that's the fruits of the Spirit, but it's just a pleasant temperament. But the deep, dark secret is that you have no peace about your salvation. And if you permit yourself to dwell on it, it'll convict you that all of this stuff is just leaves. But you got too much world in you. You got too much rebellion. You got too much pride. You've got the hypocrisy of a religious profession, just as lost as you were the day that you were born. And Jesus looks at a church and he hears the profession and he sees the leaves and he expects fruit. If he came in today and he expected your life, if he inspected your life, I wonder what kind of fruit he would find in you. You know what he does if he finds leaves and not fruit? curses it. Do you know what depart from me, you workers of iniquity? And you know what that is? That is a curse. And people have made a profession and have lived for years advertising there's fruit here. But he comes and he finds nothing but leaves. That's just covering up the deadness inside. And he curses the tree. Are you leaves? Or do you have any fruit? And maybe even right now, the Holy Spirit's bothering you. Maybe he's convicting you. If I can just get through the service, if I can get away from this conviction, what would people think? And there's people sitting in a Baptist pew that are going to hell with their pride. But when you get to hell, you ain't going to want that pride no more. Would you bow your heads with me this morning?